Have you not retaliated against American tariffs because you're concerned about the impact that would have in the upcoming CUSMA negotiations? And we've heard from Doug Ford, he thinks those negotiations are going to start in November, that Trump wants to move them up. When do you think that they're going to happen?
Thanks. First off, thanks for the question. We're in a situation right now where 85% of our trade with the United States is tariff-free. Our exports to the United States enter the United States tariff-free. 85% of U.S. trade into Canada is tariff-free. And we have put in place retaliatory tariffs in a way that looks to have the minimum impact here in Canada. That's why there's been various adjustments over time to remissions and others. We're in a position where we have the prospect, or we're engaged in discussions with the U.S., as you know, and have been for some time. The issues at the core of those negotiations will be similar to some of the issues that will come up naturally through CUSMA. There are issues around strategic sectors: steel, aluminum, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, lumber. And from our perspective, we're concentrating on those areas where our economies are deeply integrated, and working for win-win solutions between the two countries. To the last part of your question, in terms of the CUSMA review, as you know, it's scheduled for about 9 months from now. Normally, before any review process, there's consultations that begin well in advance, and so it would be natural that both in Canada, the United States, as well as Mexico, those consultations internally would begin in advance. And look, we're very conscious that there are...
It was an exchange that began like any other in the measured cadence of a press conference, but the stakes behind the question were anything but routine. A journalist pressed Mark Carney, Canada's finance minister, on whether Ottawa's reluctance to retaliate more forcefully against American tariffs was tied to concerns over upcoming CUSMA negotiations. The query referenced Ontario Premier Doug Ford's public remarks earlier in the week that President Trump was eager to move the review of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement forward, potentially beginning in November rather than next year. Carney's answer was cautious, deliberate, and revealing. Canada, he noted, currently enjoys tariff-free access for 85% of its exports to the United States, a reciprocal arrangement, as 85% of U.S. goods entering Canada face no duties. While the Trump administration's recent tariff measures have targeted sensitive sectors, Ottawa has not met them blow for blow. Instead, Carney emphasized a strategic, selective approach to retaliatory measures designed to minimize self-inflicted harm. Tariff remissions, particularly in the automotive and steel industries, have been adjusted over time to shield Canadian businesses from collateral damage. Carney underscored that the issues dominating today's trade tensions, steel, aluminum, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, lumber, are the same core concerns that will inevitably resurface in the formal CUSMA review process. Canada's focus, he said, is on sectors where the two economies are so deeply entwined that disruption would be mutually damaging. The strategy, he hinted, is not to wage a war of attrition over every slight, but to preserve leverage for the moments when it matters most. The timeline matters here. The CUSMA review, officially set for 2026, requires a lengthy consultation period that begins well before any formal renegotiations. Under normal circumstances, both sides, and Mexico, would be preparing to open those discussions roughly 9 months from now. But Ford's comments suggest that Trump wants to accelerate that process, effectively pulling forward the political and economic pressure that accompanies such high-stakes talks. For a president with a penchant for disruption, the review's timing could become a weapon in its own right. Ford himself was blunt in his warning. He predicted that Trump might act as early as November, well ahead of the formal schedule, and reminded Canadians that the U.S. president has the authority to withdraw from CUSMA with a single signature. "We've seen this movie before," Ford said, invoking the 2018 episode when Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum under the guise of national security, a move widely regarded as a bargaining tactic. "Be ready," Ford urged, framing the current moment as a rerun of those combative trade battles. Indeed, the pattern is familiar. Disputes over dairy quotas, threats to automotive supply chains, and the long-running softwood lumber quarrel have punctuated the Canada-US trade relationship for decades. Only days ago, Trump reignited tensions with a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian goods across key industries. Yet Carney's response has been anything but a mirror image of Washington's approach. Rather than unleashing a blanket retaliation, Ottawa has methodically removed counter-tariffs where they would damage Canadian firms more than their U.S. counterparts. This, Carney implied, is not a sign of weakness. It is an exercise in precision. Behind that precision lies a hard economic reality. Canada's influence in North America does not rest solely on diplomatic niceties. It is embedded in the structural dependencies of the U.S. economy. The automotive sector offers a prime example. Canadian factories supply critical components to American assembly lines. Sever those links, and production grinds to a halt, costs balloon, and jobs vanish. Energy is another linchpin. Canadian oil, natural gas, and hydropower keep American lights on and fuel tanks full. The same is true of critical minerals for electric vehicle batteries, aerospace manufacturing components, agricultural goods, and lumber for U.S. housing. Remove these building blocks, and the American economy feels the shock almost immediately. Carney's measured tone belies the strategic subtext. Tying the current tariff skirmish to the looming CUSMA review ensures that Canada retains its strongest bargaining chips. If Washington presses its advantage now, Ottawa can respond in kind when the broader trade architecture is up for renegotiation. When the stakes involve not just individual sectors, but the entire framework of continental commerce. The potential collapse of CUSMA is not a hypothetical to be dismissed lightly. Without it, Canada and the United States would revert to the baseline rules of the World Trade Organization, triggering higher tariffs, new barriers, and a destabilizing wave of uncertainty for businesses on both sides of the border. That is why Carney's approach, keeping trade flowing while quietly consolidating leverage, carries significance far beyond the day's headlines. This is not just about survival in the face of protectionist pressure. It is about shaping the conditions for the next, larger confrontation. When Carney speaks of win-win outcomes, it is not because he assumes benevolence from Washington, but because he recognizes that the surest way for Canada to win is to make sure the U.S. understands that conflict will cost them as dearly as it does us. There is a broader audience for this message. The European Union, the United Kingdom, and Indo-Pacific nations are all watching how Canada navigates an increasingly volatile relationship with its largest trading partner. Every time Ottawa demonstrates its capacity to defend its interests without resorting to destabilizing escalation, it strengthens its position as a reliable, steady partner in the global economy. This balancing act, standing firm against U.S. pressure while proving to the world that Canada is a predictable ally, is at the heart of Carney's trade doctrine. The underlying philosophy is clear. New alliances are not built from a position of desperation. They are forged when others believe you have credible alternatives. Carney's remarks, delivered with calm assurance, were not solely for the microphones in Trenton. They were a calculated signal to Washington, to America's competitors, and to Canada's prospective partners abroad. This country knows its worth, knows its options, and will act accordingly. In this light, yesterday's exchange becomes more than a footnote in the ongoing tariff dispute. It is part of a deliberate strategy to protect and project Canada's economic resilience. Carney is playing the long game, and he is betting that when the next chapter of North America's trade story is written, Canada will be holding more of the cards than many in Washington care to admit. The clash between Ottawa and Washington over tariffs is more than a simple trade dispute. It is a political chess match playing out against the backdrop of a deeply interdependent North American economy. At its core is the understanding that leverage in trade negotiations is not just about who imposes the bigger tariffs, but about who can sustain economic pressure without collapsing under it. President Trump's latest volley, a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian goods in critical sectors, follows a well-established playbook. In 2018, his administration justified steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada by invoking national security, a rationale many analysts dismissed as a transparent bargaining ploy. Back then, Ottawa responded with proportional countermeasures. Today, Mark Carney's government is rewriting the script, applying retaliation selectively and, at times, removing counter-tariffs altogether when they threaten Canadian industries more than their U.S. counterparts. To the casual observer, this restraint could appear conciliatory, but in strategic terms, it's about choosing the battlefield and the moment. In an interconnected supply chain, indiscriminate retaliation risks cutting off your own lifeline. By keeping critical trade flows open, particularly in sectors where Canada's inputs are indispensable, Carney preserves both economic stability at home and bargaining chips abroad. Consider the automotive sector, where cross-border integration runs so deep that a single vehicle may contain components assembled in both countries multiple times before it ever reaches a showroom. Slap an indiscriminate tariff on these parts, and you don't just hurt American manufacturers. You risk gutting Canadian suppliers, triggering layoffs, and disrupting a lucrative export channel. The same logic applies to steel, where Ottawa has granted targeted remissions to ensure that Canadian steel parts essential to U.S. manufacturing remain competitive and available. This approach also sends a quiet but unmistakable message to Washington. Canada will not be provoked into a fight that leaves both sides bloodied before the real negotiations even begin. Instead, it is keeping its powder dry for the upcoming CUSMA review, when every concession and threat will be amplified by the broader stakes of the agreement's future. The timing of those talks is where the political intrigue deepens. By design, CUSMA's 6-year review cycle was meant to inject predictability into the trilateral trade pact, replacing the constant uncertainty that characterized the NAFTA years. Yet Trump's eagerness to accelerate that process risks turning it into another point of leverage, one that could be used to extract concessions under the shadow of withdrawal. Doug Ford's warning that the president could pull the carpet out from underneath us at any time is not just rhetoric. The legal framework of CUSMA does indeed grant the U.S. the ability to exit with minimal notice, a reality that Canadian negotiators must account for in every decision they make today. If Trump follows through on an early review, the entire rhythm of Canada's trade diplomacy could shift. Ottawa would be forced to prepare its negotiating position months, perhaps even a year, earlier than anticipated. That means accelerating consultations with industry, ramping up political messaging, and strengthening alliances, not just with Mexico, but with other major economies whose support could offset U.S. pressure. This is where Carney's broader strategy becomes evident. While the current tariff dispute dominates headlines, Canada has been quietly building economic and security ties with partners outside North America. The recent pivot toward defense cooperation with the European Union is a prime example, signaling that Ottawa is not content to let Washington remain the sole gatekeeper to its prosperity. The same is true of growing engagement with the UK and Indo-Pacific nations, relationships that could prove vital if North American trade relations deteriorate. In practical terms, these moves serve a dual purpose. They create alternative markets for Canadian exports, reducing dependence on the U.S., and they also increase Canada's value to other global players as a stable, resource-rich partner capable of counterbalancing American dominance. In the delicate dance of trade diplomacy, being courted by multiple partners gives you more room to maneuver, but none of this changes the fact that the U.S. remains Canada's largest trading partner, and any disruption to that relationship would have profound consequences on both sides of the border. This is why Carney's rhetoric consistently returns to the idea of win-win solutions, even when the underlying message is one of resolve. By framing Canadian interests as aligned with American prosperity, he keeps the door open for cooperation, while reminding Washington of the cost of confrontation. It is a calculated form of diplomacy. Project calm, avoid unnecessary escalation, and quietly prepare for the possibility of a full-scale trade battle. The stakes in such a battle extend far beyond tariffs on steel or dairy. They encompass the entire architecture of cross-border investment, supply chain integration, and economic security that has defined North American commerce for decades. In this light, Ottawa's restraint on counter-tariffs looks less like a concession and more like a high-wire act, balancing the need to respond to domestic political pressure with the imperative to keep its strategic powder dry. The gamble is that by the time the CUSMA review arrives, whether in 2026 or earlier, Canada will be positioned to negotiate from a place of strength, its economy intact, its alliances fortified, and its leverage sharpened. The challenge, of course, is that trade politics is rarely static. Between now and any formal review, the economic and political landscape can shift dramatically. A sudden downturn, a change in U.S. congressional power, or geopolitical shocks could all alter the balance of power. For now, Carney's approach suggests he is willing to absorb short-term political hits at home in exchange for a more advantageous position in the long term. And that may be the most important lesson in this unfolding drama. In the high-stakes world of trade negotiations, the loudest player is not always the most effective. Sometimes it's the one quietly building the scaffolding for victory while their opponent shouts into the microphone. If there was one thread running through Mark Carney's remarks, it was the notion that Canada's strength lies in its interdependence with the United States, an interdependence that works both ways. By reminding Washington, subtly but unmistakably, of just how entwined the two economies are, Carney is laying the groundwork for a negotiation strategy rooted in mutual vulnerability. This is why the list of sectors he referenced, steel, aluminum, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, lumber, wasn't random. These aren't just pillars of the Canadian economy. They are arteries that feed directly into the U.S. industrial heart. Removing them would not merely inconvenience American business, it would cause real dislocation. Auto parts sourced in Ontario keep Detroit's production lines moving. Canadian lumber frames American homes. Aluminum from Quebec finds its way into U.S. aircraft, beer cans, and electronics. Even pharmaceuticals cross the border in volumes that would cause immediate shortages if disrupted. This is the quiet power Ottawa holds. The ability to disrupt without necessarily engaging in a public tariff war. And Carney knows that in the theater of trade politics, the most potent threats are often the ones left unspoken. By resisting the urge to match Trump's rhetoric blow for blow, he preserves Canada's image as a responsible actor while still keeping pressure points in reserve. The stakes become sharper when you factor in energy. The United States relies heavily on Canadian oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast. Any sudden disruption would send fuel prices soaring, strain U.S. infrastructure, and create political headaches for any administration. In an era when energy security is increasingly tied to geopolitical stability, that reliance is more than an economic fact. It's a strategic reality. Yet Carney's approach is not simply about wielding this interdependence as a weapon. It's about shaping the broader narrative. Canada, he seems to be saying, is not in the business of destabilizing trade for political theater. The country's long-term prosperity depends on predictability, on functioning supply chains, and on relationships that withstand the political swings in Washington. This message resonates internationally. It signals to the European Union, the UK, and emerging Indo-Pacific partners that Canada is the sort of ally who can be counted on even when the diplomatic seas grow rough. This reputation matters because, as much as Ottawa seeks to manage its relationship with the United States, it is equally invested in expanding its circle of reliable partners. Trade diversification has been a talking point in Canadian politics for years, but the urgency has grown as protectionist currents in the U.S. intensify. The recent moves toward greater defense and economic cooperation with Europe are not just about bolstering security, they're about embedding Canada more deeply into the global economic network, so that no single partner can exert outsized pressure. Still, diversification is not an overnight project. Building meaningful trade and security ties with new partners takes years, sometimes decades. This is why Canada cannot afford to let its U.S. relationship unravel in the meantime. The CUSMA review, whenever it arrives, will be a defining moment for the next phase of that relationship. If it goes badly, the ripple effects will be felt not just in cross-border trade statistics, but in boardrooms, factories, and ports across the country. This is where Carney's win-win language carries a dual function. On the surface, it frames Canada as a cooperative partner, open to solutions that benefit both sides. Beneath that, it establishes a baseline expectation. If the U.S. pushes too hard, Canada is prepared to act in ways that will make the cost of aggression painfully clear. It's diplomacy wrapped around deterrence. The real test will come if Trump follows through on an accelerated review timetable. In that scenario, Canada will have to reveal just how much of its current strategy is preparation and how much is improvisation. The difference between the two could determine whether Ottawa emerges from the talks with a stronger, more balanced agreement, or finds itself locked into terms that undermine its economic sovereignty for years to come. Publicly, Carney will continue to speak of dialogue, mutual benefit, and the importance of avoiding disruption. Privately, his team is no doubt running scenarios that range from amicable renegotiation to full U.S. withdrawal. The stakes are existential enough to warrant nothing less. It is telling that, even in addressing a domestic audience, Carney's words were as much aimed at Washington and other global capitals as they were at Canadians. This is the hallmark of a long-game strategist, shaping perception now to influence decisions later. He knows that in the world of high-level trade politics, the perception of strength can be almost as valuable as strength itself. As the tariff skirmishes continue, the risk for Canada is not just economic, it is reputational. Capitulation would embolden U.S. demands, but reckless escalation could alienate other partners. Navigating that narrow path requires exactly the kind of measured confidence Carney displayed. Never ceding ground unnecessarily, never closing the door on compromise, and never forgetting that the audience is bigger than the room. In the coming months, Canadians will likely see more of this calibrated messaging. The headlines may focus on the day-to-day drama of tariff announcements, political soundbites, and the occasional flare-up of nationalist rhetoric. But the real story will be the slow, deliberate positioning ahead of a renegotiation that could redefine the North American economic landscape. When that moment comes, whether in November or in 2026, Canada's ability to secure a fair and sustainable agreement will rest not on last-minute heroics, but on the groundwork being laid right now. Carney's strategy, as understated as it appears, is about ensuring that when the lights are brightest and the stakes are highest, Canada enters the room not as a junior partner pleading for terms, but as a confident, indispensable nation prepared to negotiate as an equal. And perhaps that is the clearest signal from his remarks this week. Canada is ready for whatever comes next, not because it can predict every move, but because it knows its worth, understands its leverage, and is willing to play the long game to protect both.